The Book of Mormon does not exclude other people from those who came to the New World.
What we see is that early on in the Book of Mormon, we have Lamanite and Nephite being used to identify family groups. Laman, Lemuel, a couple other people broke off and they were the Lamanites. Nephi, Sam, Jacob, Joseph, a couple others, they broke off, they became the Nephites. These are family groups that went separately. But later in the Book of Mormon, what we have that evolving into is a class distinction, if you will. Much like Jews refer to themselves as the chosen people or Israelites, and everybody else in the world is Gentile. In the Book of Mormon, it becomes the same sort of class distinction, so that later in the book, you have Nephites who believe a certain way, and everybody else is Lamanites. So it becomes much more than just a familial or a race or an ethnic distinction between people. It becomes more of a political or social distinction between two separate groups who believe things in entirely different ways.
The Lamanites, they come into play in the Book of Mormon when there's wars going on, and then they pretty much cease to exist, and it's all about the Nephites. When the Nephites came across the Mulekites, which was not obviously actually their name in the Book of Mormon, it's what we call them now, they outnumbered the Nephites by descendant. They were a large group, but they're barely mentioned. They're a blip in the history, and it's only because the Nephites interacted with them.
When Jacob gets up and talks about his definition of Nephites and Lamanites, he refers to the Nephites as being the descendants of Nephi, but also the people friendly to Nephi. Now, why would you say that? I mean, if you were not just talking about clans or tribes, but refer to people who are friendly to Nephi.
So to the Nephites, their lineage group, their tribal narrative with the Nephites, everybody else was Lamanites.
Basically, you have a us versus them, Jew and Gentile. And that same theme, that theme is throughout the Book of Mormon, and it's reiterated very strongly in the post-Golden Age, when at about 200 AD, when the dissensions and apostasy began to set back in, and the ites began to crop up. But after 200 years of unification, when there were no ites, how could you possibly identify family groups and clan lineages, lines and boundaries and so forth? They had to be simply cultural or social groups. They were factional groups. And Moroni says that. Basically, there are the Christians and the defenders of the church and the freedoms of that of the government that shelters that church, essentially. And there are those who fight against. It's them against us again.
If you interpret that introduction to mean that all of what we now consider Native Americans to be descendants from this one group and only that one group, then certainly DNA evidence invalidates that hypothesis, right? I mean, that the DNA is just not compatible with that idea. And there's lots of DNA evidence that suggests from all kinds of different genetic markers that suggest that indeed Native Americans predominantly are related to Asians. And there's lots of our anthropological data as well that supports that idea.
The evidence says that haplogroups A, B, C, and D came across the Bering Land Bridge in antiquity, and you can debate whether or not there were, 3 different migrations, each representing a haplotype, or some think that there was now one migration involving all of those. Is up for, probably still up for debate.
Well, new evidence is constantly revising and modifying hypotheses and theories about populations, in this case specifically origins of Native Americans. It was interesting to read very recently a posting by the Smithsonian on this very question of Native American origins, and they remarked that the the simplistic notion of just a few, 2 or 3 waves of immigration from an Asiatic source is no longer the consensus view, and that more and more scholars are acknowledging not only a more ancient arrival time by Paleo-Indians, Paleo populations in North America, but probably from multiple sources, some as distant as Australia, coming across the South Pacific.
First of all, we know that there were about 2,000 languages in the Americas when Columbus arrived. And only one, well, 2, possibly a third language family has been shown to be from across the Bering Strait.
This is a prime example of a paradigm shift. The old paradigm of Clovis and nothing else prior to 11,000 years ago, that facade has finally crumbled, and its fall is pronounced. And there are all sorts of new investigations, new evidences, much more ancient sites, even in the far-flung southern reaches of South America, that predate Clovis.
Several years ago, there was an article in one of the archaeology magazines that talked about some of the findings, older settlements in the south than there were in the north. Now, that couldn't be if they're all coming from the north on down. How did they get to the south? I think more and more scientists are open to the possibility that at least small groups may have come across by, it would have to be most likely oceanic crossings, perhaps through the Polynesian areas and then eventually on to the New World.
When you read actually the Book of Mormon, to me it becomes clear that there are other people here to begin with, and that Lehi and company are interacting with and intermingling with these other people. So then it becomes a population genetic question of how large is this initial population how large was the extant population when Lehi and company came? What was the genetic variation and genetic background of Lehi and his group relative to that genetic background of people who are already here? What were the relative sizes? How quickly did they intermarry or interbreed? Marriage has relatively little to do with it, but how quickly did they interbreed, and how quickly did the population expand beyond that? And those are all the factors, the population genetic factors, that go into your ability to detect a genetic signature from what would be a Middle Eastern group coming into a group that's predominantly of an Asian European background.
If indeed estimations of population were accurate, there had to have been millions of people already on these continents. And as such, the couple dozen people in Lehi's colony were a mere fraction by comparison, not even a drop in the bucket. They were just a little mist, and would have quickly been absorbed.
The critics argue that that the Book of Mormon is false because you don't see any Middle Eastern evidence in these groups. So they're wrong on 2 accounts. The first is that the question of whether you'd actually expect to see any, and that's a question that we can address to a certain extent using population genetic models and computer simulation. And again, the critics typically aren't population geneticists, so they don't know about such things, and they don't know some of the basic principles of genes in populations over time.
And of course, one of the central plot lines of the Book of Mormon is war after war after war, with these tremendous casualty counts, which each would serve as another stricture, another bottleneck that would limit the genetic diversity that was passed on to the next generation, only to be further diluted as more assimilation took place. So by the time the Lamanites, the remnant of the Lamanites, were scattered about the countryside hunting Nephites, there really wouldn't be much left of the original genetic material that was brought there. I mean, as a recognizable genotype, that is, or even as specific gene markers. And then, once you go through that all-time low in the population numbers during that period from 1500 to 1600, the samples that have been taken in modern DNA studies really don't reflect the genetic diversity that existed. And that has been acknowledged by scholars. Michael Crawford, in one of his publications, very explicitly stated that caveat, that the genetic studies being conducted today certainly do not sample the genetic diversity that existed prior to contact with Western populations.
So one, you have to couch whether it's even reasonable to expect genetic signatures. And then two, they're just wrong. I mean, the fact is, based on this paper by Noah Rosenberg from the University of Michigan, that there are, in fact, Middle Eastern haplotypes in where we as Latter-day Saints would expect them to be in this Mayan population, as opposed to across all North and South America.
Since we can't go back in time to 600 BC to sample the gene pool of Jerusalem of that era, one might think, well, let's just go back to the Middle East today. Certainly there must be some similarities, and nothing could be further from the truth. The Israelites, or the Jews rather, inhabiting the Middle East today probably have very little to do genealogically and genetically with the Israelites of 600 BC. But clearly that is not an appropriate source for a baseline comparison of would-be Israelitish markers hoped for in the gene pool of modern Native American populations.